How are you?
Right. Hello to everyone who is joining. We're a few minutes early, so we're going to give people just a couple of minutes to come on in and get settled. Good afternoon. I'm giggling because, as some of you may notice, if you can see the attendee list, I clearly sent out what was apparently my unique registration link. So you're all joining as Kaylin. So if you want, you can change your name to your actual name. But if you want to stay Kaylin, which is my actual name, you are sure welcome to. I'm totally fine in a room full of Kaylins. It's a unique experience, but we'll just give about 1 or 2 more minutes for people to get settled. I know I'm one of those people who never logs in right away, and I think we all know tech issues can sometimes be a pest that prevents us from signing in right away. So we're going to be gracious and give people 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we're going to get started because we have a lot to talk about in this session today. All right. So again, just going to give it 1 more minute here for people to get signed on. If you didn't hear me say this just a minute ago, you're all joining as me because of a link I sent out by mistake. So if you'd like to change your name, you can click on more and rename yourself, and then I can actually know who's here. Don't feel like you have to do that. You absolutely don't have to, but you should be able to click if you kind of hover over your own name. You should be able to change it by clicking rename. Sorry about that. You also can write your own name if you do write in the chat or post a question. Just write your own name before it in case we can't answer it so that we can follow up with you. Okay? Thank you. All right, so just a little housekeeping as we get started, which I am going to get started, and if people come in, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kaylin Creason, and a lot of your names are showing as Kaylin Creason. If you can rename yourself, great. Otherwise, another piece of housekeeping, both the chat and Q&A are open. We're going to save time at the end of the session today for questions. So if you do post a question or post in the chat, just indicate your name somewhere in your message so that we can follow up with you if we're not able to answer that question fully. Okay, great. So again, I'm Kaylin Creason. I'm a customer success librarian here at McGraw-Hill. And today I have the absolute honor of introducing our UME Masterclass webinar with Dr. Jason Ryan and Bob Boehringer. So today we are going to talk all about, or hear these experts talk, all about step 1, changes to step 1, and how we can ensure student success across the field. So let me start by just introducing both of our speakers who will be in conversation today. The first is Bob Boehringer. Bob is just getting his camera set up, but I will introduce him while that happens. So Bob Boehringer is the Director of Medical Test Prep for us here at McGraw-Hill. He manages a portfolio that includes RAD Review, the Case Files series, PA Exam Prep, as well as the very popular and prolific First Aid series. I'm sure you and your students are all familiar with First Aid for the USMLE. As McGraw Hill, we're excited to say that it's now gone digital. So if you haven't heard of First Aid Forward, reach out to us and we can send you some information. But that is all thanks to Bob and the excellent work of his team. And of course, the excellent students who work on every new edition of First Aid. And then along with Bob today, we have Dr. Ryan, Dr. Jason Ryan. Thank you for joining us today. So a brief bio of Dr. Ryan, really brief, because I was just saying to him, like, we might have to, this is quite the bio. So I'll try to give you a snapshot of some of the things he's done. Dr. Ryan earned a doctorate of medicine, MD, and Master in Public Health degree from the University of Connecticut in 2001. He completed his postdoctoral training at Harvard's Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, including a chief residency and cardiology fellowship. Dr. Ryan is an associate professor of medicine at the University of Connecticut, where he has been teaching medical students for over 10 years. He is the creator of Boards and Beyond, a popular medical education resource used by medical students around the world. So we are so delighted to have Bob and Dr. Ryan in conversation today. One thing that I forgot to mention is that this session is being recorded. So if you have coworkers that you know wanted to attend this session but couldn't make it today, that's okay. Everyone who registered will get a link to the recording. So if you do have to pop out for any reason, that's totally okay. You'll get a link to the recording after the session today, and that can be shared as well. This is just one video in our series of our UME Masterclass series. So stay subscribed to the email chain that you got this message from, or our marketing communications, I should say. And you'll hear about other sessions we have like this when we have experts such as Dr. Ryan talking about changes and trends in medical education. So if we could get started today, I'm gonna finally turn it over to our experts. You're sick of hearing from me. Let's get to the root of it all. So let's talk first, Dr. Ryan, hi.
Hi.
If you're
Nice
ready, it's really good to have you here. We are so excited to talk about the issue today. And if you would be so kind, could you introduce us to that issue and just talk a little bit about what's happening in medical education in regards to the Step 1 exam?
Sure. Well, what's happening depends on the school. So there's a variety of things that are going on. But general things I'm sort of hearing. Oh, Kelly, can you just mute your key clicks? Oh, thank you. But some of the things that are going on is the failure rate has gone up slightly in the last few years. It's only a few percent, still the majority of students who are first-time Step 1 test takers pass, but even an increase of just a few percent of the failure rate is a lot of students when you think about the tens of thousands that take the exam every year. And of course, failure is such a big deal when it happens to a student. Sorry, thank you for whoever said that. Tell me if you can't hear me as well now. So any increase in failures is bad, because if you've ever met a student who failed the exam, it's soul crushing. But the other thing that's going on that I hear a lot more about is delays in taking the Step 1 exam. So for example, at the University of Connecticut, students need to take the Step 1 exam by a certain date so they can then start their clinical rotations. But what keeps happening year after year is on that date, students come to the dean of students and say, I can't take this exam because I'm going to fail. I've been doing practice tests and I'm getting low scores on the practice tests. And if you make me take this by next week, I'm going to fail, and that's going to ruin my residency. So the school gives them a break. They let them start rotations a month late, but this is disruptive to all their training. It's very hard for scheduling of rotations when you have students who aren't able to start. And then some students need to delay multiple times till they pass. So the fact that the failure rate's gone up a little bit really hides what I think is the bigger story, which is that when I talk to people from lots of different schools, they all tell me the same story, which is that students are struggling to get themselves in a position where they're confident they can take this exam and pass.
So Dr. Ryan, and apologies, it didn't look like my that I was showing up on the screen, but can you talk a little bit about there always seems to be a struggle in terms of faculty thinking they should teach to the exam. What's sort of a happy balance between making sure the students are getting a rich experience in the courses, but yet also preparing them for success for the USMLE?
Yeah, so these things I'm going to tell you are just my opinions based on what I hear from a lot of people, but this is what I see is going on is our education in the first 2 years has become more clinical, and I think that's a good thing. Um, when I was a medical student, the first 6 weeks of med school, I just had a lecture 5 days a week for an hour on biochemistry, where a biochemist, one of our professors, literally drew out the pathways that go on in cellular biochemistry and explained what they were to us. Now what we do at UConn and what a lot of schools do is they try to make this more clinical. So they present a patient and then say, what's the underlying biochemistry that's happening for this patient? And that's actually a wonderful step forward in education. It's making the science relevant to patient care. The problem is the step one board exam still wants those students to know all those pathways, to know enzyme names, to know details of things that may not come up in your case that you're discussing. And so you've got this sort of chasm growing between us trying to be more clinical, to teach more clinical, which is a good thing, and then the test still testing these basic foundational things. Students still need to learn cell biology. They still need to learn basic genetics, and they may get it only in the setting of a case or two here. So that's one thing that's going on. I think our faculty are getting more clinical, which is a good thing, but that's a problem when it comes to step one. And then the other thing that's going on is this test just every 5 or 6 years seems to double in the amount of material it covers. So I took it in 1997. I used First Aid for the Boards as my resource to know what information was important to know for the test. And back then the book was about 200 or 300 pages. The edition that came out last year is 850 pages. So each year there's new drugs, there are new genes discovered, diseases are recategorized, and all these things are being added to the test. So we've got teaching that's becoming more clinical and less geared to the test, and then a test that's growing in size. And this is just sort of a recipe for students struggling to get ready for this exam. And then the other thing that's changed is it's become pass fail. So that was supposed to take the pressure off students, and maybe it did, but the the good thing when it was scored was that students were studying all the time for this exam. So by the time it actually came up, they were ready. Now it's pass fail. They're not studying as hard early on in their education, and they start to dig into study maybe a month or two before. And in my opinion, your typical student needs about 6 months to prep for this exam, where they're studying most days of the week. It varies. Some students could get away with less, some with more. And so since they're waiting for this period right before the exam to start studying, some of them find they don't have enough time.
Well, what can the school and faculty do you think, in your opinion, to help solve this problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a different answer for every school, but part of the reason like Boards and Beyond, which is the video-based learning resource I built, has been successful is because it's sort of filling that gap. Students can watch that and they're getting a 15 or 20-minute video with a basic explanation of the biochemical pathways they need to know. And then they can go to class where it's more applied. They might have an endocrinologist or a hospitalist or a surgeon going through a case and touching on the biochemistry that's relevant, but not giving them a full-on, basic ABCs type of lecture. And so I think, take this with a grain of salt. I created an online resource. Obviously, I'm biased, but I really think this is the way to fix this problem, is to have some type of third-party resource that you give to your students and give them time to use, that gives the old school teaching, what I got back in medical school, bread and butter. This is what the stomach is. This is what the kidney is. And then they can come to class and you can do the clinical and patient case-based exercises and teach them what they really need to know to be successful as physicians, but they'll be getting that sort of foundational knowledge. Anything that you aren't able to cover in your cases, they'll be getting it, and that way they'll be ready for the step one exam.
Okay, has there been any sort of talk about Is there anything coming from say the MBME side that has, that would potentially address what's going on right now?
From what I understand, and there may be attendees in this webinar who know things I don't know, and you're welcome to chime in, but from what I understand, each school is tackling this individually. I've had students tell me, at my school, they're telling us we can't bump our exam date. At my school, they're giving us more dedicated study time. At my school, they're switching to have more practice questions that are board type along the way. But it seems like each school is trying to solve this problem in their own way, whatever fits with their particular curriculum. I'm not aware of anything from on high, the USMLE, the MBME coming down and saying, this is the way to get students to prep for this test. And it probably does depend on the school. I just talked to one of my advisees a week ago. She just took step one a month or so ago. And I asked her what she thought was taught well and not taught well in the curriculum. And, there were parts of that test, important parts like renal physiology, cardiac physiology, that she said I was very prepared for by a curriculum. And I didn't really need a lot of extra help for that. I just needed to go do practice questions and refresh my memory. But then there were other things that she said, look, we never really hit on these at all. Biochemistry was one. That's why I was thinking of it earlier. And so at a school like UConn, that might be something we have to take into account. And you might have another school where the biochemistry teaching is top notch and the students feel super prepared for that, but they need help in other areas. So it's somewhat going to be school dependent, but I'm not aware of any centralized program trying to tell schools how to address this issue.
What are some of the more, I guess, kind of out of the box or creative things that you've done? And also further, have you talked to any colleagues that have had creative ways of addressing this?
I mean, the way I try to address it when I teach is I just realized that these students are super stressed about this test. They've heard from the classes ahead of them that, a couple more people failed than in past years, or that 10 or 20 students had to bump their exam date out 1, 2, 3 months, and this required them to graduate late. So they're hearing all these horror stories, and this exam is on their minds. So I actually like to use that as a hook. And when I teach, I say, okay, I'm not going to just teach you how to answer step one questions. We're going to talk about actual patients. Here's a patient I've seen with heart failure, patient I've seen with AFib. But I make sure I'm going to hit on all those step one things. I often assign the Boards and Beyond videos as prep work, so they come in already knowing that. And then we go through some real cases. We talk about medicine and how it's practiced for real life in the clinic, in the hospital. But I make sure at the end we go through a couple of MBME style questions where I say, this is how you're going to be asked about this on an exam. And let's make sure after our discussion, you're able to understand it. People often don't like to strictly teach to the exam. And I do get that, because the exam is a very contrived space. It's not reality. It's very different from what you're going to see in the clinic. So you have to do some of that. But if you're willing to put some step one learning into your lecture, I mean, you will just jive with the students so much more, and they will like what you're teaching, and you won't have as much friction. And I just think that makes for a positive learning environment.
And how often is it that the institutions will share with their faculty some of the weaker areas in terms of performance from their students?
Yeah, I mean, we don't hear so much on specific areas, but every course has feedback that's required. So all the students provide feedback. And so we all get this, we all read it every year. The problem is, in a lot of institutions, including my own, many of the faculty who teach, it is a tiny sliver of what they do. So, 90% of their work is being in the clinic, and then twice a year they sort of appear before the first and second year students and give a lecture or walk them through a case or what have you. And so it's been a struggle to get faculty like that to spend a lot of time updating the way they teach. It's easier to teach the same way they did last year and the year before, and that they have for the last 10 years. So that information is shared. We try to nudge people along, but the people that are teaching are the people that are teaching. And if you can't get them to modify how they teach, now you do have this world of online resources that you can use to fill in gaps for your students. And I think that's what places are going to start to do.
Yeah. What about things related to, and I think you sort of touched on this earlier, but different kinds of teaching methods maybe that could help.
Yeah. We have a TBL curriculum at UConn. This has become very popular. So students work, we put a case up on the board and we say, what do you want to do next for this patient? And they discuss it as a team and they share their information and the team puts up an answer and then we go through it as a group. This has become very popular. I think it's a good way to learn. It is a slow way to learn. When you do it like that, you can only go through so many topics in an hour or two because you keep stopping and giving everyone 10 minutes or so to discuss the case. So I think whatever we cover, they learn very well, but it necessarily makes it harder for us to cover that universe of 850 pages of information in first aid that they need to know for step one. And the students know this, and that's why they've been using these third-party resources so much. What's only now starting to happen slowly is the schools are starting to recognize that the third-party resources are popular, that they help students, and they're trying to work it into the curriculum so that, the students aren't trying to do one set of tasks for the school and then separately in parallel go and study for step one from some online resource.
Right. So I do know that, one of the main motivators for bringing the step one exam to pass fail was student mental well-being. Have you seen that change for the better? What has been your observation there, and further than what could people at the faculty level potentially do to make a positive impact on that?
I think the switch to pass fail has helped a lot in the first year of medical school, the really early part where students are far away from step one, because when the test was scored, I mean, it was frankly out of control. Students were coming in day one and starting to prep for the step one exam, which was 18 months or 2 years away. And it was because they knew that the higher the score they got on that exam, the more likely they were to get into a competitive residency. So by making it pass fail, there isn't a lot of motivation to ignore your school learning and study for the step one exam in the first month of med school or the first 6 months or the first year. And I think that's an opportunity for faculty. That's a great time to explore very important topics in medicine that aren't on step one. So for example, I was a heart failure doctor. I did tons of end of life and palliative care. I think it's a huge part of medicine. It's underappreciated, underutilized in clinical practice. I could teach that in the first 6 months of first year, and I would get a lot of interest from students. I think if I were to teach that 4 months before step one, the students would be dying to skip my class and not come because it's not on step one. So my advice to schools is take all these things that are important, social determinants of health, community-based medicine, palliative care. There's a million topics like this out there of things we want doctors to know, but it's not the biochemistry that's going to be heavily tested on step one exam. And teach those things early on because they are much more engaged now in the first 6 months to a year. And then you can just see the change as step one starts to get closer, where they just start getting stressed out and they don't want to come to things. And so that is my advice to schools, is to move those non-step one things to the beginning and then start to become more and more step one focused as you get 6, 9, 12 months towards the exam.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You've talked a lot about, which is really useful, the sort of the teaching methods. But is there any opportunity related to, say, like course quizzes and exams that could help, maybe align them more closely to the USMLE, or is there any opportunity there that faculty could take in terms of ensuring that students are better prepared for the step one, step two exam?
I mean, the students love it when their school exams mirror the USMLE. They absolutely love that. I teach with some faculty who understand that, and their questions are very step one like. In fact, some of the faculty I teach with have written questions for step one. I teach with other faculty who, frankly, I don't think have any idea what's on step one. And some of the questions they ask are very high level or unlike anything the students are going to see. So it really depends on the faculty you have teaching an individual course at your own school. But, if you want to get students on board with your curriculum and you want to not have friction with them, I think the more you try to test them similarly to the way they'll be tested on step one, they will really appreciate that.
Yeah, it seems like that makes a lot of sense. Are there any other trends just in general that you've noticed related to step one, either from the faculty end or the student end?
The trends I hear from students are that they are frustrated because they want to just study for step one and their school is requiring them to do non-step one type things, especially as the test gets closer. This has always been the case. I mean, even when I was in school in the 90s, when we got closer to step one, students didn't want to, go observe in the pathology lab for an afternoon or shadow someone in clinic because, they just wanted to drill for the test. But because the test has gotten so much bigger, I mean, literally the amount of information students have to know compared to what I have to know has at least doubled, probably tripled. So students want more focus on step one, especially as the exam gets closer. Some schools are recognizing this and they're meeting this demand by students, and I hear very good things. Other schools are resisting, and this is then faculty get frustrated because they say, hey, I gave them a great session today on palliative care, this is so important, and the med students all looked bored. And I know I'm saying, well, that's because the step one exam is 12 weeks away. This is what they're thinking about right now. I know of one place where students had to write a comparison of different guidelines for statins a month before the exam. That's really important statin guidelines. I mean, I deal with these all the time as a practice physician. I'm thrilled that students are going to learn. I don't think a month or two before the exam is the right place to teach that, though, because that's not the kind of thing that's going to come up on step one. And when you do that, what happens is the students get frustrated and then the faculty get frustrated because they say the students look disinterested. Why am I bothering to go through all this? So I think that's the trend I'm seeing, is just students wanting more step one focus, sometimes being heard and happy, sometimes not being heard and being unhappy. And then when they're not heard, the faculty also get frustrated by the disinterest level of the students.
Along those lines, do you think there's any correlation? We hear so often that in so many courses that students are not at all attending lecture. Is there any correlation or lesson to be learned from that piece?
Yeah, I mean, everything in medical school, especially in the first 2 years, depends on the person leading the session. So, but in our old curriculum, when we had lectures, I used to give a lecture. I gave a couple different lectures: heart failure, anticoagulants, and the lectures were optional, but most of the students came because they knew that I'd like to teach the way at their level, the way you need to know for step one exam. This was always something that was a priority to me, is saying, what do my students need to know so they can get through this very difficult exam? Other lecturers would be more research oriented and tell about their niche area of interest or something, and students didn't want to go to these type of lectures. My view is the students are adults. I did some graduate work in engineering before medical school, and there it was very hands off. Come to lecture if you want, don't come to lecture, but you got to pass the test. So my view is to make clear what we expect students to know, and then they're adults. If they want to come to our session to learn it, they can come. If they don't want to come. But I think when they're not coming, you have to look at what's happening there. Why aren't they coming? Is it because the lecture is not step one oriented? Is it some other? Are they overwhelmed with work? There's a lot of reasons that could happen.
Yeah. So we are, and by the way, we encourage anyone to submit questions in the chat, but I want to call out this one because I think it's a really good question. What is your opinion on the impact of the 18-month curricula on step one performance?
I don't think that necessarily has to have a negative or positive effect. Like I said, I really think this test takes, if you take your typical medical student who's very bright, who made it into med school, survived this gauntlet of the application process and is very bright, I think that student needs an average of about 6 months to get ready for this test. If you provide that in your 18-month curriculum, then I think that could be okay. I think, but on the other hand, if your 18-month curriculum is still filled with non-step one things, social determinants of health, palliative care, all these things that are hugely important, but not on step one. If it's filled with that and they're mandated to go to a lot of sessions on those things and also prepare for step one in 18 months, then it's not going to work. So it really depends what your curriculum looks like. Unfortunately, I wish this weren't the case, but that test dictates so much of what students want in their first year. And we avoid it at our own peril. You know, if we say, look, you know, we don't just teach the test, we're going to teach you what it's like to be a good doctor, and I'm going to teach you 100 million important things, but they're not on step one, the students are just going to check out, and you're going to have friction with your student base.
Well, I guess everything I'm hearing you say, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that that faculty need to align directly with the exam, but I guess, you know, as long as you're finding compelling ways to teach and getting the students the resources that they need, learning is learning, and that means that, you know, any type of learning is obviously going to prepare them at some level for the exam, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, another comment I just want to make is, if you haven't looked at what's on step one in a while, you might be really surprised. So, you know, when I started teaching at UConn, I was a board certified cardiologist. I took care of patients with all these different cardiology diseases. I felt ready to teach first and second year students. But then I realized that the board exam has all these pressure volume loops. And anyone who here is a doctor probably remembers learning about these. These don't, I never thought about this at all in cardiology fellowship as an attending. They just really have no direct relevance to patient care. And there are a lot of things like that that they need to know. So that's why when you switch to a more clinically driven curriculum, which is a good thing for making good doctors, you are necessarily going to neglect some of these foundational topics that just don't come up every day in their life. You know, endocrinologists don't think about the pathway for synthesizing thyroid hormone in the thyroid gland, but there's questions about that on the exam. And this is another reason why I think if you can mesh your curriculum with a third-party resource, that's great, because you don't need to tell your endocrinologist to go back and relearn the biochemistry of thyroid hormone synthesis. You can let that person teach what their expertise is, you know, how patients present with clinical endocrine disease, how they're treated in the modern era. And then you can assign like a Boards and Beyond video or some other online resource, and they can go and learn that basic stuff. But clinical practice has really, you know, in the last 50 or 60 years become much, much more separated from basic foundational physiology, science, and things like that. And I don't think a lot of practicing doctors, including myself, realize that and think about how basic some of these topics are that they need to know. And so rather than just trying to relearn that and forcing your faculty to teach that, which is a difficult task, if anyone's tried to force faculty to do anything, you can assign these resources to get at those basic topics.
Yep. You sort of answered this one, but there was another question that came through the chat. What resources can I offer to my students to help better prepare them for their step one exam?
I mean, I'm hugely biased. I created Boards and Beyond. It's the kind of resource I would have liked. It's got videos covering all the foundational topics for step one. But usually when people from schools ask me what resource should I use, I say, ask your students. I mean, don't take my word for it, but you can ask them. You'll find that most of them are using, you know, 3 or 4 different resources, and you can, you know, pick the one that you want to learn. Most of the online resources are either videos, question banks, or both. All right. So Boards and Beyond is both. There are other video resources like UWorld that's just a question bank. And so your students will know which one of these they like, which one works for them. And that's what I tell people to do.
Yeah. Another question, why is there such a disconnect between what's on step one and what's more important to being a good doctor, or what is relevant to providing patient care?
Yeah, I love that question. I think about that a lot. So my grandmother was a doctor. She graduated in 1940 from medical school, and she died when I was in medical school. But when she was in training, like if they found out a new physiology principle in an experiment on dogs, like it would, all of a sudden it became something that practicing doctors would start using. So the basic science and the clinical science were really close together, but things have really spread apart. You know, the things I do in cardiology are not because a drug works a certain way mechanistically. It's because there's a clinical study with 10,000 patients who are randomized to that drug versus a placebo, and the drug was better. You know, I'm making decisions based on clinical trials. And the boards, especially step one, is very foundational. It wants you to know DNA. It wants you to know protein synthesis. It wants you to know enzyme function. These are not these are not the way I think about drugs and surgeries and things when I practice. So because of this divorce, you know, you have practicing doctors who just aren't thinking about these things anymore all the time. Like I told you, the pressure volume loop is a great example, but there are thousands of those out there of things that practicing dermatologists would never think about, but the med students need to know a basic thing about epithelial cells and how they adhere to one another or something like that. So that's why I think the test is becoming divorced. Our teachers aren't teaching to it, and the students need some help to fill in that gap.
Okay, looks like we've got another comment. Our students really are enjoying Boards and Beyond and very beneficial in their preparation. What additional resources would you suggest?
My favorite resource is Up to Date. You know, I go to that all the time. I use it when I make my videos. I also use textbooks when I make my videos, like Costanzo Physiology is my favorite physiology book, and I based a lot of the videos on that. So I tell students to go to these things when they need more help. The interesting thing about Gen Z is they don't like to read textbooks. You know, they like videos, they like podcasts. So it depends what they're struggling with. But I coached some students who either fail step one or can't pass step one, and we often go back to like a Costanzo and find like a blurb and try to read through that and make sense of it to get them to get at the underlying issue. Students who are struggling are interesting because they're not all the same. That's obvious fact, but it's true. Whenever the students are struggling, I usually tell them to find me 5 or 10 MBME or UWorld or whatever questions that they're struggling with and bring them to me, and we go through them. And what I find is always interesting. Some students have a foundational issue. You know, they don't really understand Crohn's disease. That's why they're getting the question wrong. Other times it's a test taking issue, frankly. They're getting lost in the weeds of all the information in the STEM. And then other times a vocabulary issue. Like I had a student who thought attenuate and accentuate meant the same thing and they're opposite words. So I said, why are you picking this answer? And they said, because it says, which of the following attenuates this effect? And so we had to sort of talk about vocabulary there and being careful as you read. So it really depends on what the student is struggling with, what they need to help them get to that next level.
But you just said something there that I think is really, really key in terms of how you sort of bring in third-party resources in a way that's like really meaningful. So like in this example, I really like the idea of you having students come to you with UWorld questions that they missed, because then they sort of almost like it's sort of like you become their, not necessarily their built-in tutor, but their built-in advisor so that you can focus on the things that, you know, perhaps they were struggling with. But I think that's a really good, feels like it sounds like a really interesting way to bring in the third-party resources in a way that, you know, really does help them gain a better understanding.
I love when students bring me questions because first of all, I get to see what type of questions they're facing. And honestly, sometimes I tell them this question is extremely nitpicky. It's super hard. I don't think you're going to see this in your exam. And they say, shoot, because they don't know that. You know, they might think this super fine detail is the most important thing to know about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And I'll tell them it's not. And they love hearing that. So I think that's a lot of the future of medicine too. There's like when I have 50 students in a room, I sometimes wish I could just get those 5 students who are really struggling, because I know like 45 of them could go and learn all this on their own. Give me the 5 that are struggling. Let's go through it together. Let's find out what you need and let the other people go and learn on their own.
Yeah, but I suppose that would also be a way, if you get enough consistent feedback from people that are using a third-party resource, that, you know, there's areas that they're struggling with, that could be an opportunity to be also to even bring the topic up in class, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I've learned things that I put into my videos from student questions. You know, I watched your video, Dr. Ryan, and I still don't understand dead space and pulmonary physiology. And then they tell me what they took from my video, and I say, oh, I didn't realize someone might take it that way, and we figure it out. And then when I update the video, you know, I fix that part. So you become a better teacher when you see how students interpret the things you say or the things they read or hear from other resources.
Okay, we've got another question. This one's pretty challenging. If medicine practice is based on clinical trials, does this mean that medicine practice is more whoops, sorry, it went up in the, sorry, does that mean that medicine practice is more public health and statistics than biological science?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. It depends on where you are, you know. Um, First of all, in the research realm, the basic science is really important. So, you know, knowing how drugs work and bind enzymes, DNA works, all these things are very important for that. Some practice of medicine is a lot more clinical. I definitely think medicine is not practiced. This is obvious, but I just think it needs to be stated. We don't practice medicine now like we did in 1960. You know, back then, I think of my grandmother being like a young primary care doctor in a small town in Virginia, and you know, she's doing things based on theoretical evidence. You know, we understand that this lab experiment showed X, so I'm going to give you this pill and hope it makes you better. And we've learned over the years that many of those things that we thought were good for patients either didn't help or sometimes even were harmful. And so now we've become much more clinically driven by clinical trials. So the basic science is still important. It would be a shame to not teach it at all. But I do think there's an avenue here to update medical education and not emphasize these basic science things that aren't as relevant so much anymore. I'm not saying you never teach them, but you know, students will spend months memorizing biochemical pathways and memorizing parts of the cell membrane, and practicing physicians do not know this stuff. Should they know that those things exist? Of course, but do we need to test them so heavily? I feel like we could probably update things, but that's a much bigger topic because that has to do with, you know, changing the step one exam, which is very hard to do.
Yeah. Another question for you. It seems that students have taken their foot off the accelerator with the pass fail, and they've um, and I'm sorry, the question just went up again. Students have taken their foot off the accelerator with pass fail, and this person wants to know what are the implications of less intense study of many, if not most, of their students on their step two success. Then,
Yeah. I mean, I think when step one first went, pass fail, students and schools took their foot off the gas. You know, students felt like they didn't need to start studying till a month before the test, and faculty also felt like, okay, now that step one's pass fail, we don't have to teach so many of these step one topics. We're free to teach more of these other non-step one things for medicine. So, but now I think the pendulum's starting to swing back. I mean, there've been so many, I hear this from so many schools that they can't get their students ready for this exam, and that the students delay and delay. It disrupts their schedule. Some students, it disrupts their graduation. They borrow money for an extra year. It's a very costly thing that they aren't able to take this exam within the designated period. So I think the pendulum's starting to swing the other way. The problem is the test is so huge that it's really hard to tweak your curriculum to meet all the needs of everything on this exam, you know. So like at my own school institution, you know, people said, okay, students are struggling with step one, so let's give them a couple of step one questions every week that we go through with them. That's great. But you're barely going to touch on 20% of the topics doing that for an entire 2 years of medical school. You know, so the test is just so massive that I think students need an outside resource that they go through on their own that hits all the basic topics so that they can learn them. And then support from their school if they need more help.
yeah, well, this has all been really good. And I also think that from my standpoint, if I were just to summarize and come up with a theme based on what we've talked about, it seems like that, you know, instead of faculty maybe having this feeling that they're shackled a bit by this, that they should feel empowered, you know, to also help play a role in the success of their students related to the USMLE Step exam. But I was just wanting to hear from your standpoint. What do you think if you were summarizing everything we've talked about, also including the questions that came from the group? What would you say is your one key takeaway?
I mean, I think this is a great time to teach medical students. I'm obviously in a unique position, but when I teach them, I don't have to teach how pressure volume loops work anymore. I can say, watch the video and then come to class. And in class, now they know the basics. So we can start trying to apply those to different clinical situations. We could do practice questions together, or I could tell them to go home and watch the video on heart failure and atrial fibrillation, and they could come to class and we can walk through an actual patient of mine who has those conditions, and they can understand it at a basic level. So I think if you're willing to embrace these outside third-party resources, they can really free you up. You have to give students time to use them. You can't say, here's Boards and Beyond, here's UWorld, but now we're going to fill 10 hours of every day of the week with lectures on palliative care and other things that aren't on step one, because then they're just going to be frustrated that they never have time to get to that. But if you make that part of their assigned work, and that's what I tried to do, the course I taught, always had assigned preparation, and I made it the third-party resource that I knew they like to use, then it became easier for me to teach, because now I don't have to say, okay, what's atrial fibrillation? And no one knows what it is. They all know what it is. Now I can say, let me show you some EKGs of atrial fibrillation and let's see some patients. You guys are going to tell me how to manage them now because you watched my video. And that is, to me, is much more fun than teaching the ABCs.
Yeah. Okay. We do have one more question. We used to have a clinician and a basic scientist facilitate same session of PBL, but that has changed and only one facilitator per PBL group. How would you reconcile the approaches? What are your thoughts?
It's getting more challenging for PhDs to teach clinical cases because, like I said, so much of what we do is not driven by the basic science. It's not driven by the protein structure in the beta receptor. It's driven by a clinical trial of beta blockers versus calcium channel blockers. So I think it's really imperative now to have some type of clinical input if you're going to teach anything sort of case-based, prepare for the real world kind of stuff. But even a clinician, you need to have a clinician who understands what first and second year medical students need to know. I heard from a med student, the pressure volume loop thing again, went to one of his faculty saying he didn't understand it. And the faculty member was a cardiologist, said, oh, those are dumb. Nobody uses those anymore. And like, this is not helpful because there could be 5 to 10 questions on the step one exam about pressure volume loops. So you need to have clinical faculty who understand the level of medicine students need to know for step one. And then I really think it helps to have someone clinically oriented teaching these days, because it just has become so divorced from the basic science, what we do in so many cases. And if you don't have that knowledge, you do need to know the basic science. And I talk about beta receptors and alpha receptors all the time with the students, but you also have to be able to understand what it means when you're out in the real world.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ryan. And just for everyone on the call today, we really thank you. And I do want to tell you one of the reasons that we specifically chose to have this discussion with Dr. Ryan is that the impact I think he's had on medical students is just, you hear about it anecdotally, but when we attend conferences with him and see the reaction from students, not to mention comments like, I should be paying you for my medical education because, you've done such a good job of educating me throughout it, really speaks to his commitment to educating and, just his overall expertise. So I really appreciate all of your insights. I think my internal colleagues thought I was going to forget about this other question coming up, but I wasn't. I was purposely putting it at the end so that we could kind of wrap it up in terms of our training services. But Dr. Ryan, thank you so much for your insights. And what I love about the way you speak is that you give really straightforward, no nonsense, practical advice that I think, everyone can basically put into practice.
Sure. Yeah. I just shared my email with the attendees. So if you have any questions or anything I can answer, I'm happy to do so. I love when the students appreciate my teaching, but to be honest, I think a lot of faculty can do what I did. What I did was figured out what level they need to know for step one and tried to make sure that was always covered in my lectures. That doesn't mean that was the only thing I covered. I also told them real stories of my own patients, but I made sure I hit on all those basic topics, and that is really what they're looking for. And you can bring that into your own teaching if you want, or you can outsource it now because there are so many resources that can provide it. And then they'll get the foundational step 1 level stuff, and you can touch on that as you choose to do so, but also talk about higher level things that matter for real patient care.
Great. So we did the question that I was holding. I think the best person to answer this would be Kaylin. And that is, does McGraw-Hill give training or best practices on how to use products like Boards and Beyond and First Aid Forward? So Kaylin, you were so kind to call us all experts. So I am going to hand this over to you because this is exactly your expertise.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Ryan and Bob, for that really great session. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone here learned a lot. I've put Dr. Ryan's email in the chat again, and then my team's email, because when it comes to training best practices and all things McGraw-Hill, my team, the customer success team, is really here to support users, whether those be the end users, the students, or also like the end users that are the faculty. Whatever questions you have or whatever tips you want, training best practices on how to use Boards and Beyond or First Aid Forward. The question specifically was about M1 and M2, but of course we're here to help support your use of all of our products, whether it's Access Medicine and everything else. We are absolutely here to provide that training and those best practices. So just email my team. We'd be happy to get in touch and talk about the specific needs of your students or your institution and really work to make sure that these resources can work for you and your goals. And I see that our marketing manager has also added some links to our entire UME product suite, including Boards and Beyond and First Aid Forward. So be sure to click on those links to check those out and be in touch with any questions you have.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
So much. All right. Have a great day. I think we'll stick around for just a few minutes if anyone has questions, but if you don't have a question, feel free to hop off. You'll get a link to the recording soon. Thank you. You may share the recording with other faculty. Please, we encourage you to do so. Yeah, you can share the recording with students as well, I believe. I don't see why not. Yeah, everything here, this was a totally public webinar, so share it far and wide, especially if it's helpful for your faculty and students. Please, thank you. Thank you so much. All right, if there are any other questions, speak now. All right, thank you, everyone. I'm going to close this out.
Okay, bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.